right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 208 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. My name is Billy Bob. I am on the left coast. It is 9 a.m., a little bit after 9 a.m. I've got my regular co-host joining us. He's streaming live from his dacha in Crimea, Ian Cummer. We are having a little bit of technical difficulties as always, so just bear with us. We hope for the best as the show progresses. Our special guest today is Milan. He is streaming live also from the West Coast. He is an ACP member cadre. And today we wanted to revisit Ian's great article from a week ago discussing the rise of fascism in Europe. And we want to, contextualize that historically and, contemporarily, if that's a word, contemporarily. So where to begin, guys? It's a broad topic. You know what? I want to start out just sharing some quotes. And so the thumbnail for this video contains a few quotes from people like van der Leyen, from Merz, the former chancellor in Germany. And, there was, I think, a French general in a meeting with some mayors talking about how, we need to prepare ourselves to, lose our children in the upcoming conflict. So if you look at the thumbnail of this episode, should I just read them or what? I'm not even prepared to read them.
Yeah, if you can pull them up, that'd be great. Get some quotes.
Okay. Yeah. I don't need to pull them up on my phone because nobody's gonna be able to see. So let me try and pull up the image. While I'm pulling up the image, Ian, what you want to just introduce your article again for those that have not had a chance to read it since last episode?
Well, how about we start with Milan? You can tell me about how you came across the article and what your reaction to it. So, guys, this is an article I wrote saying that. So, okay, I'll summarize. I contradicted myself. I'll summarize, and then Milan, why don't you tell us your impressions? So, I wrote this article saying that I think there is going to be a major political shift in Europe. And everybody fights with me about the labels that I use. But basically, I say it's a progressive left-leaning regime in Europe right now. And if you ask them, they're like, we're leftists. I mean, you can ask any EU, council member or whoever, they'll say they're leftists. So I'm just using their label. So they're leftists. And my prediction is that Ukraine is going to be the catalyst or the straw that broke the camel's back, or or just whatever idiom or analogy you want to use, is going to be the event that triggers a rightward shift. And I made the comparison in Germany in World War II. You had Weimar Germany, which was very progressive, had a lot of strange, so let's just call them strange social idea. A lot of things, a lot to unpack there. And then the Great Depression, all this anti-Marxist, anti-communist sentiment brought the Nazis into power. And I made that analogy that with Ukraine's going to lose, and a lot of the reason Ukraine loses is because of the inept half measures of the current European government. I also brought up that there are things they could have done for Ukraine that they either did slowly, or they did incompetently, or they just didn't want to break their own ideological norms. And so people are going to blame them for that, and that's going to cause a major right-wing shift. And unlike what all the propaganda says, how right-wing parties like Vox in Spain, or AFD in Germany, or whatever Le Pen's party is called, I forget, in France. They're not, pro-Russian parties, not at all. So we can assume that even if you have this right-wing shift, they're going to be mostly the same, if not more aggressive towards Russia. And they're going to sell themselves as we're going to do it right. So yeah, Milan, do you want to... Oh, Millie Bob, did you find that photo?
Yeah, okay. So here's the quotes. We got Merz saying Statutory pension insurance alone will at best still provide only basic coverage for old age. Bonderland, let's see. We are in an era of rearmament, and Europe is ready to massively increase its defense spending. This is the guy, the French general. If our community falters because it is not prepared to accept, let's be honest, to lose its children as we, rearm and prepare to take on Russia. And then we have Trump. We have to take care of one thing, and that is military protection. So he said the government just can't do Medicare, can't do child care, can't do old age care. We just got to focus on defense. But I also wanted to, thank Milan for joining us, because he is under the weather, and a lesser man would have just canceled and rescheduled. So Milan is powering through a man cold. And believe me, if I'm not 100%, if I'm only 99.5%, I'm going to cancel everything and stay in bed. So thank you, Milan, for powering through your cold here. So yeah, where would you like to take it from here, sir? It's a broad topic.
Yeah. No, I mean, just a quick response to the thumbnail and the quotes that you just read. I mean, I think they have to sell, right, this war. 2030 is the year that we often hear about when Europe could perhaps be ready to, take on some, let's say, even bolder moves than it currently has. But I personally think all of this is sort of a last-ditch attempt to sort of jumpstart the stagnation in the economy and, really having very few cards left to play. I think what is really interesting, and another thing I wanted to mention maybe later on, but I think this is a good place, for about 4 decades now, about 40 years, right, we have been told that the state should stay out, right, that the markets should decide which way the economy goes. We went through, years and years of neoliberal reforms that have completely gutted a lot of European industry. And what's ironic is that we are coming back to it, right? But we are coming back to it through war. So I think Europe is going to rediscover state-directed industrial policies, right? But not to obviously serve the population, but instead prepare it for the inevitable conflict with the rising powers, which are Russia and China. But they're doing it in an interesting way as well, right? You have the scaremongering, like the quotes you've just read, but at the same time, on the other, end of the spectrum, to pacify the population when they get a little bit panicky, they'll tell them that, Russia is completely inadequate, right? Or completely sloppy in their response. Look how long it's taking them to, achieve the goals that they supposedly said could be done in a couple of days. So they kind of keep going back and forth between presenting Russia as this great menace, but at the same time as, this struggling, nation that can't get its stuff together. So that's, my 2 cents on what you've just posted. But in terms of Ian's article, I think that you identify a lot of, interesting connections and whatnot. But I think for us communists, right, fascism is much more concrete than, the diluted term that a lot of people throw around today. I think we'll all agree that people use the word to describe all kinds of things, right? You'll use it to describe Putin or, I don't know, Orban in Hungary. You'll use it to describe just your run-of-the-mill Republican politician talking about family values, right? Or, people who are maybe nostalgic for, Nazi imagery like Elon Musk. Everybody's a fascist, right? If you're not into cosmopolitan liberal shenanigans and culture wars, you're a fascist. But for us communists, we usually place it in a historical context, right, in which it arose in the 20th century. So I thought it would, be a pretty interesting conversation or discussion to see if the conditions that were present in, Weimar Republic or Germany in the early 30s and Italy 1920s are comparable to what is going on today. I think that some are, but I think that there is a huge missing element, which I think might and probably will bring on authoritarianism, which is already here, right? But not necessarily fascism as it was back then. And I think the main missing component, right, is the organized working class, which I don't see anywhere in Europe. Occasionally, you do have protests and demonstrations. You had the yellow vests and whatnot. But to me, they all seem very spontaneous and sporadic, right? They're usually not channeled into working class politics or a party that could, channel it and spearhead it into a movement that would actually threaten, the property relations that exist in Europe today. And I think because of this missing component, Europe will go authoritarian. But I don't think they have to resort to fascism because the current tools that they have, right, through parliamentary democracies or liberal democracies are quite enough for them to do what they have been doing already, right? It hasn't stopped them from intervening in Russia, aiding the U.S. efforts to, aggressively punish the unruly countries in the Middle East. So I think liberal democracy works just fine for them. I think fascism would even be risky at this point because for communists, right, we think that fascism is sort of a last resort for the ruling class. It comes about when there is a significant, right, threat of communists taking over and actually threatening, the status quo, which I don't really see in Europe today. I can also go a little bit into, the history of Italy in the 1920s and Germany 1930s, just to sort of, highlight and magnify this point even more. Like the 1920s in Italy, right? This was right after the Russian Revolution. There was a fear that, communism would spread. And they had for about 2 years, from 1919 to 1920, I think they called it something like Biennio Rosso, right? 2 red years, where there really was a rise of socialism. You had factory occupations in cities like Milan and Turin, right? You had a bunch of peasants asking for land reform. And the role of fascism in Italy was to destroy this, burgeoning working class movement. The black shirts were sent to beat up workers, destroy, their organizations, councils, and whatnot. And then Germany's, an even more illustrative example. I think the part that would make your article complete, right, would be to mention that, for example, KPD, the communists in Germany, were approaching about 6 million votes, right, in the 32 election. I mean, they had workers' councils, they had organized paramilitary, workers' militias. They had their newspapers, their institutions. There really was a threat that communism would take over in Germany. And then the power was just relinquished to Hitler, and his first targets were, workers, the working class. First people who go to concentration camps, were
communists.
Yeah, they attacked trade unionists and whatnot. So I think without that component today, I think liberal democracy as is today is going to continue. I think it even benefits the ruling class because it legitimizes it, right? If you don't have to resort to repressions and you can still do whatever you want through elections and, have people be proud of voting and participating and thinking that they have influence, I think that's a much smarter strategy than, going outright fascist, even if they lose, right, in Ukraine, which I think they will. So, I mean, that's again a lot, but that's sort of where my mind went when I read your article and some of the notes that I took down. But I don't know. I guess my question to you would be, do you think that, fascism will be necessary considering that there isn't this left-wing threat in Europe?
Well, that's a great question because what makes predictions, the more variables as you try to predict it makes it less. Of course, well, doesn't necessarily make it less likely. It's just more likely to be wrong. So here, I'm giving a specific what's going to trigger it is Ukraine, and that also gives us a kind of a specific time frame, probably in the next couple of years, and saying it's going to be specifically fascism. Now, I could be mistaken because, like you said, it's a reaction. Fascism is a reaction to communism, to organized labor, but we really don't have too much of that. So it's entirely possible that we'll just have maybe a more authoritarian regime. They might even, like you said, say we'll just stick with liberal democracy. However, I don't think we're going to have that either. I don't think we're going to stick with liberal democracy, and the reason why is because it at least ostensibly, at least on the surface, allows dissent. Of course, yeah, you have guys like, what's that journalist's name in the 90s who exposed the CIA selling crack in black neighborhoods. What was his name?
Gary Webb, I think. Yeah, Gary Webb.
Yes, like him. They didn't assassinate him. They didn't put him on trial and execute him for treason. They just used the actual media industry itself to lean on this guy. And he did something pretty substantial. I mean, imagine if someone did that in an actual really authoritarian regime like Nazi Germany or even Franco's Spain. I mean, do you imagine someone publishing? No, he wouldn't even be allowed to publish the article at all. I think you're going to see the end of, even the pretense of free speech. People love to bring up, like, for example, people love to bring up Russia. It's like, well, in Russia, you can't stand in Red Square and say Putin's an idiot and the war is bad, but you can say Ronald Reagan is an idiot, by the way. You can, that's a reference to the joke, you can stand in Red Square and say Ronald Reagan's an idiot. But I would say any, and this is true for every government, regardless of whether they claim to be a democracy or if they have free speech. If you say something that is that they consider a quantifiable threat, they won't allow it. So the reason on the surface the USA seems more free, I think it's actually accurate to say Americans have more free speech than most people. Maybe not all. I want to say all because it's such an extreme statement, but most people in the world. We have more free speech than most people in the world. But part of the reason for that is that the USA is in such a strong position. There's not a lot that's legitimately a danger to it. We don't have these big enemies on our borders that we're in constant danger of a land war with. And we have like, what do we have? We have Mexico, Canada, and Cuba off the coast of Florida. There's not a lot of threats there. We don't even really have major adversaries that are sabotaging. We say, Russian hackers, Chinese hackers are breaking our smart fridges and, introducing virus. But I mean, real threats. There's not really any organized enemy actually trying to hurt the USA. I mean, they hyped up Al Qaeda as that enemy, but we saw that turned out. The FBI literally had to frame people and basically provoke people into doing something terroristic. Like there were at least several cases of that. They would either send a double agent into the Muslim community to try to get them to find someone to radicalize they would find like the mentally disabled, like a mentally disabled guy working at a 7-Eleven or something, has an immigrant's background, so they can hype him up as Hezbollah or Al Qaeda or something. But there's really no actual organized attacks on the USA to speak of. So, and that's part of the reason we don't have these speech codes. When there have been in the past, like with World War II, World War I, the Espionage Act, then you see what happens when there is actually a serious threat to the USA. You see what happens to free speech, and immediately it's gone. So that was I apologize, a bit of a long-winded answer. Did I really answer your question, Milan? There's a little bit.
No,
I know
I
it's a
mean,
little meandering.
No. I think you've raised. I mean, there's really no disagreement here. I think the way public relations in the United States work is, unlike anything the world has seen. I think, they've had over a century of practice, right? And they know what works and what doesn't. And like you said, censorship sort of works progressively with the threats, right? If there are no threats, and usually there aren't, we are separated from the rest of the world by 2 oceans, and our neighbors are not posing any danger to us. So you can have dissident intellectuals talk their entire careers, right, without ever in any way endangering the current, status quo or the property relations. I mean, I don't know, people like Noam Chomsky come to mind, right? He could publish books, he could lecture and have an MIT position basically his entire life. If necessary, he could be censored from time to time, but his biggest worry was that maybe he was going to get arrested during, Vietnam, and he had his wife get a PhD too. I mean, these are not sort of the repressions that communists faced in, Germany, during during the rise of the Nazis. And you can say all you want, right, online. You can post all kinds of radical comments. But as long as you don't have an organization that actually has a popular support, that is organizing workplaces, that is actually going after the ruling class in direct ways, free speech is going to be allowed. I think now that we have these outside threats, right? And by we, I mean not us, but the ruling class. I think censorship is more and more noticeable. I mean, especially in Europe, I would say that, the British are sort of going overboard. There are certain things that are criminalized, right, that you can't even say publicly. I don't know what it was, but Max Blumenthal was guesting on Piers Morgan, and he dared him to say, certain phrase that that would have gotten him in trouble in Britain. And he is, one of the biggest proponents of how, the Western world still has these freedoms that, barbaric Russians and, Chinese don't. I mean, if there were to be a significant threat, you wouldn't only see censorship, but you would see the kind of, clamping down that, would make what Russia and China do, really insignificant. And there are cases in the U.S. history where those things did happen. I mean, Black Panthers, for example, right? Black Panthers perhaps were not as powerful as it was made out to be, but they were going in the direction that, the regime and the ruling class didn't like. And they confronted them with, absolute aggression and violence. So I think, just to kind of go back to the original point, I think if you were to, for example, see, a party like ACP rise and gain, I don't know, tens of thousands of active members, and and if we had success organizing workplaces and getting public support, behind us, I think at that point, the government would resort to all kinds of repressive measures. But as long as you're small, right, and as long as they deem you insignificant, they will allow you to, say pretty much anything as long as it's not an outright threat or, something like that.
So I want to bring up a couple comments. We've got a lot of good comments today, so we're gonna let's see. We'll start near the beginning. So we got one. We got from so I'll start with Daryl. Milan with the most nuanced definition of the third position I've ever heard on the Blowback. So that's a compliment, by the way. We get a lot of we have a diversity of opinion in our guests. Usually they're not this nuanced, so it's good to have you here. Now Alexei, who I actually know,
I don't think that was a compliment, but yeah, completely wrong though.
So Alexei has a couple comments here which are relevant to what we're talking about. First of all, I will remind you that Putin tried to join NATO, but somehow was rejected. So when we talk about external enemies, well, they're external enemies because, well, we want them to be external enemies, or I wouldn't even say we want them to. We've defined them as external enemies, as like to say, Russia. I mean, Russia. I would say the most succinct way to describe the end of the Cold War was because the Russian bourgeoisie wanted to join the American financial system. And that includes, as a tertiary, that includes joining the security system, joining NATO, joining the security apparatus, which Alexei also mentions. When we started the global war on terror against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, they actually provided, there were, by the way, protests. There were some actual protests, and not I wouldn't say huge protests, but there was a little bit of backlash because of anti-NATO sentiment, anti-war sentiments, but they did provide military support, logistical support. I think we actually briefly used some of their bases to attack Afghanistan.
Yeah,
so there was a lot of. What did that get them? What did that get Russia? What did that do anything for Putin? Did it do anything for Russia? I would say no. It wasn't. It wasn't acknowledged or reciprocated in any way. It's just Russia's this big bad adversary that's an imperialist and hates American values and freedom. Another comment from Daryl. Noam Chomsky's biggest worry was getting caught with his brother Epstein. I remember when those emails, I don't think it was a leak, because they were actually released. The redacted emails were released, and Noam Chomsky was mentioned a bunch of times. And there have been accusations that he's controlled the opposition, and that wouldn't actually surprise me. Alexei again brings up Milan, you're probably forgotten the McCarthyism. Well, the McCarthyism, I would say, it's a good point. Though they weren't shooting people. I mean, there were people arrested. There were people who were politically and economically ruined by McCarthyism. They didn't. I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being mild and 10 being extreme, I would give McCarthyism probably a 6. And also we have to consider that part of the reason it went as far as it did was because Eisenhower found it useful because it was primarily Democrats who were being branded as communists. So he let McCarthy kind of run around accusing everybody of being communists because that hurt and it discredited Democrats. What ended and it's important to remember what ended McCarthyism. What ended McCarthyism is that after McCarthy was done with the State Department, accusing State Department people, he went after the military. He went after, I think it was the U.S. Army specifically. I don't remember the details. It was either DOD or the U.S. Army. And that's when
And
he
the higher ups
basically,
as well. Yeah.
yeah, he came across a bigger fish in the pond, and so he started getting the negative media attention and the backlash, and they went after, they pushed back, and that's what broke him, and that's what ended McCarthyism.
So this is an
And
interesting discussion, right? We're talking about the context here is Western Empire in a crisis, and we see the trajectory is towards more censorship, towards more repression, as it has to deal with these threats to its existence. But the original point that Milan made was that there is just no domestic organized resistance, right? The resistance is coming from without, and it's not coming from within, which allows the domestic policies to remain relatively benign and unrepressive, because there's really nothing to repress. And I totally agree with Milan when he says, if there was a force, if there was a strong organized domestic force, then that would, of course, necessitate, a strong, more McCarthyist-like era where they really, engage in repression. But because that doesn't exist, it's not necessary. And I think all that is true and obvious. Censorship is a very interesting topic for me. It's interesting to see how the United States and the West champions the idea of free speech, and how they really have no interest in free speech, and they just have their own way of controlling speech, through the billionaire control of the press and their control of the algorithms on social media. So they're not, they don't do it overtly like China does. China says, no, you're not going to be allowed to say this. You're going to get in trouble if you say this. The U.S. does it differently. And part of the differences, like Milan had already explained, was because, China has actually threatened, whereas the United States has no threats, either externally or internally, to its system. It's not like there's, armies on our borders that, are threatening us with nuclear weapons or even conventional weapons. So the kinds of censorship that the West engages in is different than what is engaged in by the anti-imperialist bloc. But okay, what do you guys think? Thank you for letting me jump in. I wanted to say something, so that's what I have to say.
We had to praise our sponsors, the People's Republic of China. It's very important. That's
yes.
why we had to get that product placement in there.
You're gonna get us
but I
banned
was gonna
and censored.
External pressure. I mean, there is and there isn't. I mean, there's some pushback, but I don't think there's actually any other major country that declared the American-led system to include Europe and the Commonwealth countries, the usual suspects, the free world, if you will. There's no one just saying we are an enemy of this system. China sees it as beneficial because it's the framework that they use to access marketplaces. So China approves of the globalist system and doesn't want to see it. And Russia wanted to be a part of the system also, but they were ostracized to the point they never really got their foots in the door. You can even if you look at the economic trends over time. In 2008, there was a bit of a recession in Russia, but it wasn't anywhere to the extreme as in other Western countries because they just were not very connected to the USA to begin with. And there's more comments. Skoidat is a longtime viewer of us. Hello, Skoidat, good to see you. Another Daryl comments. The FD parodies led by a lesbian married to a Sri Lankan immigrant, worst Nazi adjacent party ever. Well, that's true. You can even say the same about the USA. Actually, both. Now that I think about both of them, Trump is married to an immigrant, a Balkan immigrant, and J.D. Vance is married to an Indian immigrant. Kamala Harris, who is the other candidate, who deserves to win, is married to a Jew. Yes, if you look at, there's not a lot of, if you just look at traditional values, nationalists, Nazi types, we have very weird
I mean,
lineup.
I think,
That's true.
yeah, I think obviously, right, racism and racial superiority was a huge component of Nazi ideology. But I think the primary sort of point of fascism was, again, to repress the working class and to preserve the, property conditions that existed. I think the main goal of Nazism was to preserve Krupp and other German industrial powerhouses, have them stay in the private hands, and then racism and racial superiority was later on used to obviously justify a lot of the material aims of Nazi Germany. Meaning occupying a ton of land in Eastern Europe for the benefit of German industrialists. So, yeah, I mean, I think fascism could come in any superficial form. I don't think that the racial component is necessarily, the foundation of it. I think it's a facade, right, that is generally used to justify the economic and materialist aims of fascist movements. But yeah, I mean, just a few comments. You spoke quite a bit about Russia. I mean, I really don't have any disagreement there. I think Putin originally, right, sort of wanted to have free trade. I mean, there was a famous quote from Vladivostok to Lisbon. I think he really wanted to be accepted, in the current order, but he wanted to be accepted as an equal partner, and that's something that Western capital would not do. And they were able to tolerate him. I mean, I don't know if you remember, there are a ton of pictures of Putin meeting with George W. Bush, and they had quite a good relationship, hanging out even privately. You mentioned how Russia really did not get in the way in the interventions in the Middle East in the early 2000s. But I do think that when things really started to change was when Putin decided to intervene in Syria. So this is prior to the Ukrainian mess. He I don't know if you remember, the United States was just about to attack, like the chemical attacks took place, right? That was used as a pretext for the US intervention. And then Putin got carried to agree that, there should be inspections and maybe all of the, chemical weapons should be moved to Russia and whatnot. And in a way, put a stop to the immediate plan of aggression in Syria. And then later on, right, I mean, Russians did most of the, fighting with ISIS, and they completely depleted them, and they were able to keep Assad in power for much longer. And I think this is the point where the Americans saw Russia as someone who might, interfere with their geopolitical aims. And I personally think that Ukraine was sort of a get back, right, for Russia daring to interfere in Syria. Because it almost starts right afterwards, right? The coup in Ukraine and everything else that followed. So I think that was sort of the breaking point. And then, Putin's sort of slowly realizing that there really isn't going back. I mean, he'll sometimes mention Yugoslavia and the NATO intervention there as sort of his turning point, but a lot of those things in the early 2000s happened where, that let me think that he was still sort of holding on to the hope that Russia would be, accepted in the sort of Western global order. I think when it really changes was Syria. And of course, right, I mean, 90s were horrible, and I'm sure in Russia, the transition was just awful. And I think the reason why Putin has such trust and support in Russia is because, for the most part, he put an end to that. I think I think the sweet period was sort of the mid 2000s, and then a decade afterwards, where he nationalized some of the energy and used the proceeds to raise pensions and living standards, and obviously for neoliberals, right, which is sort of the dominant economic order in Europe, that is a big no-no, right? According to them, he should have continued, right, the policies of Yeltsin and completely liberalizing the economy and privatizing absolutely everything, austerity measures and whatnot. And I think, Putin had different ideas, and that sort of put him on the radar as well. But it's also interesting to think, how naive, the Western ruling class was to think that, Russia would not recover and that there wouldn't be a response to the, economic shock of the 90s. And I think now they obviously regret letting it slip. I think even in your article, you sort of discussed the, European wish to balkanize Russia, to, break it up into manageable parts that could be much more easily exploited. I do think that there's a huge regret that now that wasn't done in the 90s when Russia was a lot more vulnerable.
Well, so it goes back before 2004. Well, because one, actually, Alexei beat me to it. Syria was 2015. Maidan was 2013.
Syria started in 2011. Syria started in 2011.
But Russia didn't intervene in force until 2000. And actually, remember this because I was at the time I was at Fort Hood in Texas. We were going on deployment to Kuwait with an aviation brigade, and some of our subordinate units were also going to Syria. And this was when Putin officially announced the war against ISIS. Because Syria did have, not Syria, Russia did have bases in Syria since the 1970s, but they didn't announce the war until 2015. And I remember because I was in Texas at the time.
I'm just making the point that doesn't preclude the idea that
we have 2008 was Georgia. We can even go back further than that. We can go with Chechnya. Now, Chechnya was strange because that started even under not even Putin, but Yeltsin. And that was and so I would look at all those. I would see even Syria could be interpreted as an attempt to get Russia dragged into an expensive proxy war. Armenia and Azerbaijan. I've been to Armenia, and I have to agree that was definitely an attempt to get Russia into that war. On Armenia's side, and they had the Pashtun, they had the Velvet Revolution. You had a way for Armenia could not only not be an ally of Russia, but at the same time say, well, Russia's the aggressor here. We don't have anything to do with it. So I definitely interpret that as an attempt to get Russia sucked into a ground conflict. Georgia with go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm not saying that there haven't been previous attempts to weaken Russia or to drag it into, conflicts and whatnot. And even in Ukraine, you had the Orange Revolution, right, that, came prior to all of this. But I think where sort of a direct confrontation, right, where it becomes really obvious with Russia is, the beginning stages of the war in Syria, and then what followed in Ukraine. So yeah, there's they're all all of those events. Especially Chechnya, Georgia, that go to show that Russia was still considered to be a threat. Hillary, Clinton was naming it, Mitt Romney was naming it during the elections. Right, it was always sort of a boogeyman to be wary of and to. And used for all kinds of political and economic aims. But I do think that, a clear distinction of we have to really confront Russia and its influence in the former Soviet states was during the conflict in Syria, and then obviously what came later.
Well, and you can see Obama was trying to, he wanted to pivot to China. He accused Mitt Romney of having the foreign policy of yesteryear that was anti-Russian. And so Obama was cognizant of the long-running strategy that we do not want to push, we being the imperialists, do not want to push Russia closer to China. And so Obama was trying to say, trying to hold off on really being aggressive against Russia. And he wanted to, pivot to China.
I think you're putting more thoughts into Obama's statement than Obama himself. Honestly, I mean, a lot of people make fun of him for saying that, but he wasn't the president yet.
And then obviously Trump took that and ran with it, right? He took a lot of political heat. Trump took a lot of political heat in his first 4 years, going out of his way to be kind and to say nice things about Russia, because in his mind as well, he was very cognizant of it's stupid to push these two countries together. But the ruling class ultimately discovered that it's not going to be possible to separate these two, because luckily Russia has a thoughtful leadership, and so does China, and so they understand exactly what is going on here, and they're not going to allow Western machinations to split them, especially with when you look at the Sino-Soviet split and how disastrous that turned out. So this is kind of the thread that you can see from Obama to Trump. And now they've kind of given up on it, right? They're really kind of given up on it because they see the impossibility of driving a wedge between these two powers. But I mean, I can definitely see how that was affecting the things that were being said by Obama and obviously by Trump in his first 4 years. But what are we talking about? We're talking about Russia. Obviously the West has always wanted to balkanize Russia and steal their resources. Like, that's what the West want. They don't want a strong Russia. They don't want a partnership of a strong Russia. They don't want a partnership. They want to balkanize, destroy, and rape the resources of fucking Russia. So that's it. That's all that's going on. That's all that's been going on. I mean, it's really obvious. They thought they could use Putin. They were hoping they could use Putin just like they used Yeltsin, a weak Putin. And he just, after they realized they didn't have a weak Putin to push around, then he became, a problem. But George Bush looked in his eyes, saw that he was a good man in 2000, because there was still hope. There was hope that he could be a Russian, a Western agent.
I think it's well, I mean, it's true, and a lot of people say it. It's about the Russian natural resources, which is true, but I think is also an oversimplification, because I mean, why do they whine about Russia specifically, not Africa, for example? We don't hear about the threat of Africa. But why? Because it's not. I mean, they have a lot of natural resources too, but they're not politically a threat. Russia is Europe's most populous country.
Daryl's making me laugh today. He's being very clever. Thank you, Daryl.
It's the most populous European country, 150 million people, and it's also the only continental power that has not been defeated and subjugated by the Anglosphere, if you will, Britain and the USA and the Commonwealth, right? I mean, you used to in the previous century, you had several. I mean, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had Germany, you had you had several different things. I mean, even France, to an extent, France had an empire, was the second largest country on earth. They were, relative to the rest of the world, a lot stronger than they are now. But all those empires and those continental powers are gone, except Russia. Russia's a little smaller than it was 100 years ago. Hence the joke that when Joe Biden said he was going to take Russia back to the 19th century, some people interpreted that he was going to restore Russia's lost territory to them. He's going to give them back Poland and the Balkans, the Baltics and Central Asia. But I think that's more of the reason why, because it's more so than any other, because there's other countries in the world that are geopolitically a threat.
I mean,
but
sure.
Russia is more than anyone else an alternative. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
But I think, like Russophobia, right, and why Russia is one of the primary targets is really not a secret. Throughout history, Russia would be portrayed as either a barbaric or an ally, depending on, whatever the material interest of certain European powers were. So, if you look at, up until, I would say, Peter the Great, right, Russia was just something that was on the conceptual border of Europe. Europeans didn't really care much about it. But then, Peter the Great and his successors really started to bother a lot of Europeans. They got access to the Baltic, right? They defeated Sweden, and suddenly, Russia was a threat. Later on, during the Napoleonic Wars, for example, Russia was, for some European powers, an ally, right? And it became a threat shortly after because it became clear that Russia could militarily basically get to the center of Europe, right? So again, it was a barbaric autocracy. And it was, right? But people calling it that were, Britain and other colonial powers and imperial powers. Later on, for example, during the Crimean War, Russia becomes the enemy again. If you look at the British newspapers at the time, right, you would find similar sort of language that is used today to describe Russia. And it was mostly because the British thought that, the maritime routes to India, especially the importance of Eastern Mediterranean Sea and the Straits, right, and the Turkey were quite important for the British. Russia was also expanding to the Central Asian countries, and Britain was paranoid that, Russia had its aims at India as well. So obviously these were material things that Britain cared about, and they wanted to preserve the order which benefited them at the time. But then Germany becomes the main threat to the British because Germany industrializes, right, in the sort of middle and second half of the 19th century, and it challenges Britain as the main European power. And then, lo and behold, right, Russia can become a friend again. So the result of that is the First World War and the Triple Entente, where, Russia was accepted as an ally. But then what happens after the First World War, right? Russia pulls out, you have the Russian Revolution, and then you have this whole new reason why, Russia should be feared and hated. And this, more than anything, right, is still sort of there in the memory, I think, of the Western powers, meaning the, socialist revolution and a genuine threat, right, that the property relations in Europe could completely change, that capitalism could perhaps, see its last days. But then, Second World War, again, Uncle Joe, right? We can sort of dismiss the criticisms we have to face this mutual threat at the time in Nazi Germany. But then right afterwards, right, who becomes their enemy again that is vilified and maligned, right? It's the Soviet Union. 90s, right, where Russia was more of a joke. The Soviet Union dissolves. No one really cared about Russia. And if you mentioned it, it was usually something derogatory about, alcoholism and, the stereotypes that they have about Russia. But, it wasn't a threat. then Putin comes to power and sort of changes the expectations that Europe had of Russia. All of these things that we mentioned before, we don't have to mention them again, take place. And suddenly, right, Russia presents again a danger to the neoliberal order that, to Western powers and Western ruling classes is basically all or nothing kind of game, right? You cannot have a significant portion of Eurasia go in its own direction. Everybody has to be subjugated and follow what the Western ruling class is prescribing. So now, right, it gets to the point where Russia is a regional threat. You have China basically weaning away and taking over parts of the global South that used to be dominated by Western capital. And obviously that threat has to be faced, right? And the more time passes, the narrower the window becomes. And that's why I think we see such an, intensification of the confrontation with both Russia and China. And I do think, right, that they try to pull sort of a reverse Nixon, right, to separate Russia from China. I think that would be great for the Western powers because China at that point is isolated. And obviously the war in Iran, right, the aggression in Iran is, in my opinion, targeted more so towards China than anything else. Of course, there are immediate aims. Any regime that has any modicum of independence or autonomy cannot be tolerated. But the fact that they are a soft underbelly of China, and so many negative things could come about if there was to be a regime change in Iran that was favorable to the West. I think is all aimed at weakening the rise of China. So, I don't know. When I analyze these things, right, I sort of just start with the question of who benefits materially, right? And I think having a multipolar world is not something that was expected when the Soviet Union dissolved. There were about 2 decades of the sweet period where, the US hegemony could basically do anything it wanted. And now there are these, significant powers that could retaliate, that have their own way of thinking and organizing, their politics and economy, that obviously pose a huge threat, to the ruling classes in the United States and the EU mainly. I think you're muted, Billy.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. They look on regret, a real big regret at allowing China to be part of the World Trade Organization, for instance, and to just not continue to try and oppress and repress them like they have continued to oppress and repress North Korea, Cuba, any other aspiring socialist country. So they really thought that once the Sino-Soviet split happened, that they could infiltrate China economically, and through economic infiltration, they could infiltrate the politics and get a liberal political government in power. And they tried really hard to do that, and it failed. But while they were failing, they created an economic monster, and they had no appreciation for how successful socialism and a planned economies can be. To really, it is impossible to overstate the economic success that China has had in such a short period of time, and how they are right now, the #1 trade partner of way more than half the countries, and all the rest of them, they're like the #2 trade partner. It's like, they're just such a powerhouse on all fronts, and most people have no appreciation, no concept for what China has accomplished using, socialism. And so, but yeah, that's the threat that the West is seeing, and they understand, and they lament, allowing China to do this, because again, they did by ending the embargo, by opening up, by offshoring all of Western industries to China. They facilitated this rise, and so they're sad, but they don't know what to do. They're fucked. And
Yeah.
but go ahead.
No, I was just going to add. I think Trump coming into this, last administration after he won the second time, I think there was a concerted effort and a lot of optimism that China could be confronted, right, very quickly. And I think two major things happened that sort of exposed the weakness of the American position, right? Because if you remember, like tariffs were, something that was on the table and talked about so much. But when China retaliated, especially with rare earths, right? I think the U.S. realized, how much they fucked up, because for decades and decades, right? China was building an industrial policy where all kinds of aspects of China's economy could be summoned to produce things, right, that are necessary and that the West cannot live without. Without the rare earths, I mean, there goes your entire military industrial complex. So the confidence with which Scott Bessent, for example, approached tariffs, basically saying, "Oh, it's the exporting countries that are going to suffer. If we place tariffs, China's economy is gonna scream and falter almost promptly." And obviously that didn't happen, right? Because there was this trick, up the sleeve of China that they used, which was the rare earths. And I think the second big moment happened recently. Like a few months ago, right? Almost every headline talked about the oil crisis, right? How the oil crisis stemming from the conflict in Iran would so severely, curtail the rise of China that, it was bound to basically change its ways. But then they realized how well prepared, right, China was for the conflict. I mean, they've stored enough oil to last them for about a year. And how organized things really are. I mean, China has been investing in not only renewable energies, they started burning more coal as well during this critical period, but also the population, right, which trusts the government, was advised to, carpool and use public transportation and use less energy. And something like that is unthinkable, right, in Western capitalist countries. We may see it with suspicion because, we have been, brainwashed and programmed to look after our personal interests for so long that, seeing a unity of a nation, especially that populace, respond to the crisis in such a way was a huge wake-up call for the West. And so much so, and this is the point that I raised early on when we just started, so much so that there has been this silent admission by the Western capitalists that the Chinese model is working, and that is an increasing investment, and not just investment, but taking equity in specific segments of the American economy by the state. Like in August of last year, for example, I think the U.S. government bought about 10% of Intel, right? And since then, they have been buying stakes in all of these, corporations that do work with rare earths and batteries and things that are going to be necessary for the war effort. They even have this, I forgot the term, but it's something like golden share or something like that, where even if the U.S. Government owns about 5%, for example, of U.S. steel, they still have specific powers and they can direct the production and, have the veto power. So, but they're putting this thing piecemeal, right? They're obviously neglecting every other sector of economy and trying to do what China does only within the limits of the military-industrial complex. But they're slowly taking over and basically admitting that planning does work, right? That you cannot let markets and profit-driven economy, tackle such a huge threat that China is, because markets will go where profit is, right? And that, like you said, Billy, was the problem in the first place. for American corporations, right, that need rare earths, it was much cheaper to import them from China than to build, factories and processing plants in the United States, because that's a long-term investment. Shareholders cannot wait, and which is the reason why the industry in the United States has been decimated, because it left.
Yeah.
So I think this sort of tacit admission that the Chinese model works is a huge development, and you sort of see it creep up, at least in certain industries that are, related and necessary for the war effort.
Yeah, the free market rhetoric, it was never real. Like free markets, it wasn't, there's no such thing as a free market, but the imposition of the free market on the planet was beneficial to the West. And the minute that imposition is no longer beneficial, the rhetoric changes, and the United States is now trying to emulate China as a command economy to have more control and be more adaptable to these upcoming challenges. There's no doubt that they want more control over the commanding heights of the economy. And like you said, specifically and especially for the military industrial complex, as they start realizing that, the market is not going to provide an unlimited supply of missile interceptors, etc. But Ian, you were trying to get in on something, I thought.
I was going to say China is more, it's true, China is very populous, but more unified than Western countries, well, in parts because it's an ethno state. It's 90% Han's Chinese. And there is the argument that communism for them is just it's a rebranded Confucianism. It gives the state legitimacy. It's the state ideology, if you will. But I think that's a sidebar conversation. However, being unified doesn't make them an enemy. I mean, this has been on Milan. I don't know how much you've watched the show here, but there's been an ongoing debate between us that, because Billy Bob tells us we're going to pivot to China, we're pivoting to China, It's going to happen, any minute now. And I've been more skeptical. It looks like you lean more towards his side of the aisle on that. I don't really, if anything, I think the last several years have shown a noticeable softening of viewpoints towards China. If anything, I would look at the news media, what politicians say, what official statements say, and it's all softer towards China than what it was 4 years ago. Now,
I don't think
that Trump literally just took an aircraft carrier out of Asia. I mean, if he's pivoting to Asia, why is he taking military equipment out of Asia to fight Iran?
I think
strange, don't you?
Yeah, but I think the part where the disagreement comes about is that I think both Billy and I, the conflict in Iran, being targeted mostly at China, right? I mean, obviously Iran has been an issue and a problem on its own, but I do think that a huge component of it is, China imports about 10% of its crude oil from Iran. If that goes away, that affects the Chinese production. I think all of these efforts, partly, Russia, maybe not directly, but, are all aimed at what, the Western establishment deems as its primary geopolitical enemy, which is the one that has been cutting into its profit, and that is China. So I don't think, the war in Iran is a separate issue from China. I think it's a stepping stone towards, what they see as the ultimate confrontation. If you can wean off Iran and Russia from China, right, then it becomes a much more manageable target. Instead of attacking it directly now, you could attack it later on when it's much more vulnerable. But as far as the rhetoric goes, I mean, just recently, the Uyghur genocide is still, kind of making a comeback, and it's in the headlines. The issues around Taiwan are, always there. I think superficially, it seems like, taking the USS George Washington and, being, having it sent to Iran seems like perhaps, things are cooling down with China, but I think they have to go through Iran first before, they can at some point in the near future, I agree, target China more directly.
I mean, I'm sorry, I have to disagree with both of you. It's not substantial. I mean, you can look at the ring around China, and there's no way to spin it as stronger than a few years ago. It got weaker because they sent equipment to Ukraine, and then it got weaker again because they sent more equipment to Iran, and it's been weakened a third time when Trump is just saying, you know what, we don't need to have South Korea so militarized. And yes, it affects Russia to an extent, but South Korea is the main strongholds against China.
But I think
one of the major.
But I think all of that could be interpreted as maybe the sloppiness, right, of and maybe overconfidence of the Western elite, thinking that, I mean, I think initially, right, everybody thought that Iran was going to be something like Venezuela, right, that you can just go in, take out the leadership, basically instill someone, implant someone that is favorable to Western interests and go on from there. I did not think that they expected such resistance from Iran, and I think this also caught him by surprise. So I think a lot of it was foolishness on the part of the Western ruling elites to think that Iran would be such an easy opponent to conquer and defeat. And I think now they have to improvise and sort of make it work, and trying to resolve these unexpected obstacles and issues that came about.
Early on in the program, this is what I kind of wanted to address, the thing you're bringing up right now, because I agree with what you're saying. They had a strategy. They had a plan. It involved, being way more successful ostensibly than they have been. And so my question is, given what I think is a colossal and rather surprising, I mean, I never assumed Iran would be a pushover, or that, the United States would even be able to do anything militarily against Iran. But, what I am surprised at is the rhetoric, even in the establishment press, talking about the colossal loss, that the U.S. is experiencing right now. So, given this loss, what do we think this setback is going to do to the overall strategy and the pivot to China? Now, again, I'm sorry, Ian, because you reject the whole premise. And so this question is not at all interesting to you because, from your perspective, it's all based on this false premise. But, I'm wondering, it's just such a huge defeat. And how can the United States even pivot to China given the clusterfuck that they've just gone through? Like, I mean, this is the question that is interesting to me. Like, how does it happen? Does it just get delayed by a year or two, or do they push ahead and just cause chaos? Like, I'm really interested in. I'm having, there's technical issues. I'm getting alerts, and we just lost Ian, and it says we're having trouble streaming to Facebook. Anyway, Milan, you're still here. I know we're streaming to some other areas, even if the Facebook stream stopped. But, how do you think what just happened, what we're seeing play out right now, is going to affect the long-term the long-term strategy, to attain hegemony, which is predicated on defeating China, isolating and containing China.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the optimistic part of me, which probably isn't all that realistic, is that, the rational thing to do would be to withdraw and accept the reality of things, right? Accept the fact that, China is here to stay, that, Russia has its regional interest, and sort of accept being a pole in a multipolar world, right? I think that would be the rational way to go about things. But obviously, that is probably not going to happen. I think admitting any sort of defeat and pulling back now is not something that's on the table. So we might just see more of the same. It may not be some sort of a catastrophic event, right, or something abrupt, but sort of a slow drip and a very slow decline, and basically more of the same for for at least the near future. I also don't think that, probably having learned at least some lessons in Iran, that the establishment thinks that they could tackle on the issue of China more directly within the next year or two. But I do not think that they will let go of these plans and just sort of accept, the reality as is. I do think that, they'll go back to the drawing table and see in what ways, direct and proxy, right, they could try to sabotage and slow down the rise of China. But I just don't see how a direct military conflict, right, could be on the table, at least right now. I think you're muted.
People like Mearsheimer, who give the justification and really support and say it's in the national interest of the United States to contain and isolate China. So even Mearsheimer will say that, we want to avoid a direct hot war with China. That is not our interest. We want to isolate and contain them, without getting into a direct war. And he always expresses confidence that this can happen. And I'm always surprised that I never really hear an explanation for how that can happen. But yeah, no, I don't think, like you, they've had this tremendous setback. It's pathetic. The empire is really struggling on really the initial steps of this grand hegemonic strategy. And so, if they were rational, they would just, adapt to the multipolar order instead of trying to, maintain their unipolar hegemony. But they're not going to, like you said, I agree. And we're going to see, what their strategy is going to be.
I think we can maybe connect this to sort of this new state-directed industrial policy that is trying to develop in the United States. I think through the tariff wars and they have sort of discovered what crucial things they're still dependent on China, right? Especially when it comes to rare earths and things like that. So I think maybe they will spend some time building up those, at least sufficiently enough, right, so that a complete cutoff with China will not be as dramatic, and then perhaps go back to it then, because I think they have uncovered a lot of weaknesses, during this economic war with China and then hot war with Iran, that they have to address before making another bolder move, that could basically, change things forever.
Yeah, their ideal timeline is definitely getting delayed. but they're still, they're still on track. They're still on trajectory. And yeah, they're always learning. These are all, they're learning the weaknesses, like you said, and then they're going to take measures to deal with those. Yeah, and those measures are not free market, letting the free market decide everything. It's going to be more command economy and taking control over the vital industries, like you said, finding new places to develop rare earths that aren't dependent on China, and then tightening their leash on the vassals like Japan, and ensuring that they are more than ever tied at the hip to the United States and the U.S. dollar, so that they have no ability to switch sides or to be neutral. We're tightening the leash on these vassals so that they can be our proxies. And
then you also see like how chaotic, right, things have gotten, right? So as much as there might have been this initial plan, and obviously, right, Japan and South Korea and the Philippines have been under the boot for, quite some time now. But like, for example, recently to bail out Japan, right, the United States had to screw over Europe. And now the Europeans are mad because, instead of, because they basically used euro to prop up, the Japanese currency. And now Europeans are pretty mad about it. And I'm sure no one consulted with them, before the move was made. So I think the messier things get, there are going to be more chances of, rifts and conflicts, even between the, imperial partnerships.
Yeah. A lot of comrades have just concluded that the empire lost, right? That their job is too difficult, it's too hard, and they can never do it. And they're, any effort that they put into it is just going to be laughable. So, I mean, that is an opinion and a position that I find intriguing, and it's a little bit enticing. Like, I want to join because you see what's going on, and you see they're just tripping over their shoes as they're, walking across the bar to try and punch China, and they can't even make it 1 foot. So on the one hand, I am seeing a lot of comrades that are thinking it's over, like they can't do anything. But on the other hand, I'm not quite prepared to jump, full force into that position. Like, I'm still wary. I still think that the West has, definitely, motives and an interest in, and they're not afraid to cause chaos, to cause pain to the entire planet, in pursuit of this. And so I'm not ready to laugh at their efforts, because I think they're still dangerous. But I cut you off, I think, to make that point, Milan, and I'm sorry. I know you had to go. I wanted to get in a shout out to the California worker. I know I've written something for them. You've written some things for them. I know you wanted to get the plug in, but it looks like we lost Ian. I'm not saying we're wrapping up right now, but I wanted to leave it up to you because I know you're under the weather. And
and also I have and parenting responsibilities. But yeah, California Workers is ACP California run. We cover a lot of local issues, but also some geopolitics. I've written a few articles there, so check it out. It's on X as well. And also, I mean, things are getting chaotic and wild and strange, and the only way for things to change is for people to organize, right? Which was my main motivation of joining the American Communist Party. We're still small, but I think we punch well above our weight. We, go wherever workers need us, whether it's, protests, picket lines. We've been trying to organize drayage truckers up in Northern California, where I'm at. We have been setting up community gardens for people. We bring the supplies, we bring the seeds, we do the work, right? Food prices are getting crazy. So these may not seem like, huge acts that will shift, anything in the near future. but I think it's a pretty good start. So, for those listeners that are willing, go check out the American Communist Party. We are pretty much on every social media that exists, and just kind of, get to know the kinds of things that we have been up to.
And I've joined too for the exact same reasons. Watching everything unfold. I felt like I wanted to do something and to connect with other like-minded people as we're watching this historic time take place, and to make a difference, to make a positive difference. And when I looked at different parties, like the platform of the ACP is what really spoke to me. And it's what caused me to join. It's like they understand what I'm saying, like what we talk about on this program. It does not contradict anything. Like there's we have the same perspective on these things, and so those are the kind of people I wanted to connect with and work with. So I don't talk about it very much on the program. I know that's divisive. Political parties can be divisive, but I definitely, that's what I decided to do as an individual was to join the party for a lot of the reasons you said too, Milan. Are we ready to wrap it? Should we just set to reschedule our next episode? It looks like I lost my co-host. In Crimea, the network is not that strong for whatever reason, but I'm sure it has to do with geopolitics. But yeah, Milan, thank you so much for coming on, and for you had some great insights, some great commentary. I really appreciate your contributions to the discussion, and we're going to have you back. I'm hoping to see you in person tomorrow when we have our party meetup. So, but yeah, thank you for watching, and we will reconvene either later this week or next week. We will see everybody then. Thanks a lot. Bye.